Welcome back to the shadows. Tonight, we have gathered 3 accounts that are not the product of fiction, but the chilling reality of those who survived them. These are stories that linger long after the lights go out, whispered in the dead of night. If you're listening to this alone, perhaps you should check the locks on your doors one more time. The world is much larger and more terrifying than we often care to admit, and sometimes the fin cycle bump in the night are closer than you think. Let the silence settle around you as we begin our first journey into the unknown. Take a deep breath. Try to relax. But whatever you do, do not close your eyes. Our first story takes us to the isolated wilderness of northern Maine. Marcus, a seasoned hiker, thought he knew the woods like the back of his hand. He had spent weeks alone in the brush, but nothing prepared him for the silence that descended upon his campsite on the 3rd night. It wasn't a natural silence. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket that seemed to push the very air from his lungs. The crickets stopped, the wind died. Even the crackle of his small campfire felt muted, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Marcus sat perfectly still, his hand hovering over his knife, listening to the void where nature's symphony should have been. Then he heard it, a rhythmic, heavy dragging sound just beyond the tree line. The dragging sound was slow, deliberate, and metallic. It sounded like someone was pulling a heavy chain across the frozen ground. Marcus stared into the darkness, his eyes straining to find a shape, but the forest offered nothing but shadows. Every few seconds, the sound would stop, and Marcus could swear he heard a wet, raspy breathing, a sound too large to belong to any coyote or bear. He didn't dare call out. He didn't dare move. He sat there for hours, a prisoner of his own fear, until the dragging sound circled his tent 3 times. It stopped directly behind his head, separated only by a thin layer of nylon. He felt the fabric press inward slightly, as if something was leaning its weight against his shelter, sniffing the air. When the sun finally broke through the canopy, the presence was gone. Marcus didn't wait to pack his gear properly. He stuffed his sleeping bag into his pack and bolted toward the trailhead. He didn't look back until he reached his truck. But when he finally got home and unpacked, he found something that chilled him to the core. On the back of his tent, right where he had felt the pressure the night before, were 3 long, perfectly vertical slices in the fabric. They weren't claw marks. They were clean, precise cuts made by a blade. Whatever had been circling him that night hadn't been an animal, and it hadn't been looking for food. It had been waiting for him to fall asleep. He hasn't stepped foot in those woods since. Transitioning from the woods to the suburbs, our second story involves a young woman named Clara. Clara lived in a modern apartment complex with high-end security, but she always felt like she was being watched. It started with small things. A chair moved an inch to the left, a light left on that she was certain she had turned off. She chalked it up to stress and long hours at work. But one Tuesday evening, she found a Polaroid photo tucked under her pillow. It was a picture of her sleeping, taken from the corner of her own bedroom. The timestamp on the back was from the previous night. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she realized someone had been in her room while she was completely vulnerable. Terrified, Clara called the police and changed her locks immediately. She installed a hidden camera disguised as a bookshelf ornament. For 2 days, nothing happened. On the 3rd night, she stayed at a friend's house but kept the camera feed open on her phone. At 3:14 a.m., she received a motion alert. She watched the screen, her breath catching in her throat. The closet door in her bedroom slowly creaked open. A thin, pale hand reached out from the darkness of the closet, followed by a man she had never seen before. He was gaunt, wearing clothes that looked decades old. He didn't steal anything. He simply walked to her bed, sat on the edge, and began to stroke the empty pillow where her head would have been. The man stayed there for nearly an hour, whispering to the empty air. Clara watched in horror from miles away as he eventually stood up, walked to the camera, and stared directly into the lens. He smiled, a wide, toothless grin that seemed to stretch too far across his face. Then he leaned in and whispered a name that Clara hadn't told anyone in years, her childhood nickname. The police arrived minutes later, but the apartment was empty. The man had vanished. When they searched the closet, they found a false panel leading into the building's ventilation system. He had been living in the walls of the complex for months, watching her through the vents, learning her secrets. Clara moved out the next morning and hasn't lived in an apartment building since.
Our final story takes us to a lonely stretch of highway in the Nevada desert. David was driving cross-country, pushing through the night to make up time. The desert at night is a different world, silent, vast, and indifferent. Around 2 a.m., David saw a figure standing on the shoulder of the road. As his headlights swept over the person, he realized it was a woman in a vintage floral dress holding a suitcase. She didn't have her thumb out. She was just standing there, staring straight ahead into the darkness. David slowed down, intending to ask if she needed help, but as he drew closer, he noticed something impossible. The woman wasn't touching the ground. She was hovering just an inch above the scorched pavement, her dress completely still despite the desert wind. David's instinct was to slam on the brakes, but a primitive fear took hold of him, screaming at him to keep moving. He sped past her, his heart racing. When he glanced in his rearview mirror, she was gone. The road behind him was empty. He tried to convince himself it was an optical illusion, a trick of the light and his tired mind. But then, his car radio began to static. A low, distorted voice began to bleed through the speakers, repeating a series of numbers over and over. Coordinates. David realized with a jolt of terror that the coordinates pointed to a spot just a few miles ahead on this very road. He tried to turn the radio off, but the dial wouldn't budge. The voice grew louder, more frantic, sounding less like a person and more like a machine breaking down. As he reached the coordinates, David saw a wreck. It was an old car, a model from the 1950s, flipped over in a ditch. It looked like it had been there for decades, rusted and skeletal. Beside the wreck stood the woman in the floral dress. This time, she was looking directly at him. Her face was a mask of sorrow, her eyes weeping a thick black fluid. David didn't stop. He pushed his car to its absolute limit, the engine screaming as he raced toward the nearest town. When he finally reached a gas station and told the attendant what he'd seen, the man's face went pale. He told David that 50 years ago, a woman had died in a crash at that exact spot while waiting for her husband to pick her up. She's been waiting there ever since. David spent the rest of the night in the brightly lit gas station, unable to face the dark road again. The memory of that woman, the way she hovered, the way she looked through him rather than at him, is burned into his mind. It's a reminder that some tragedies never truly end. They just repeat themselves in the silence of the night, waiting for a witness. We often think of ghosts as spirits in old houses, but perhaps they are everywhere, trapped in the moments of their greatest pain, bound to the places where their lives were cut short. If you find yourself on a lonely road tonight, keep your eyes on the pavement. You might not want to see who is standing on the shoulder, waiting for a ride that will never come. These stories serve as a grim reminder that the world we see during the day is only half the truth. When the sun sets, the rules change, and the things we dismiss as impossible become terrifyingly real. Whether it's a stranger in your walls, a presence in the woods, or a spirit on the highway, the unknown is always closer than we care to admit. The next time you hear a floorboard creak or see a shadow move in the corner of your eye, don't be so quick to tell yourself it's just the wind. Sometimes the wind doesn't whisper your name. Sometimes the wind doesn't watch you sleep. Stay vigilant, stay safe, and try to get some rest, if you can.
Thank you for joining me in the dark tonight. If these stories chilled your blood, then my work here is done. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more updates and more journeys into the macabre. Share your own encounters in the comments below. I read every single one, and you never know, your story might be the one I tell next time. Until then, keep your lights bright and your doors locked. The night is long, and there are many more stories waiting to be told. Sleep well, if you dare. Good night.